First striking forces in the most momentous assault of all time were the paratroopers, scheduled to drop behind the enemy's lines. The 175,000 men who made up the air and ground forces for the cross-channel attack arrived at the various ports of embarkation on the English coast by June 3rd, under heavy guard. The thousands of ships and small craft which comprised the invasion fleet were waiting in readiness to take aboard their human cargo. More than 4,000 ships and small craft were to ferry across the channel the men who were to land on the French coast on D-Day itself. To facilitate the advance of the troops once the invasion was launched, thousands of vehicles were loaded aboard the same ships which were to transport the men. On the days directly preceding D-Day, the southern coasts of England were alive with activity. The Allied invasion forces were bracing themselves for the mighty effort which at that moment was looked upon by many as the greatest military gamble in history. In spite of the vastness of the force of men and equipment involved in the attack, preparations for the departure of the assault units were conducted smoothly and efficiently. The last of the ships which were to participate in the D-Day assault were loaded to capacity, and the time for departure from the English coast was finally at hand. In the late afternoon of June 5th, D-Day -1, all preparations finally ended. The invasion fleet moved into the channel and made ready to assume the intricate pattern of positions from which, the following morning, the invasion of the French coast of the Nazis' European fortress would be launched. The moment all the world was tensely awaiting was now only hours away. The plan was for 3 Allied airborne divisions to land behind the beaches to cut Nazi communications and disorganize the enemy. Then, some 5 hours later, the first Allied invasion troops were to storm ashore on a 50-mile stretch of the French coast bordering the English Channel. D-Day finally dawned. The weather was favorable. The attack on the French coast was stepped up.
The air plan, already in execution, called for the progressive wearing down of the Luftwaffe and the destruction of critical points in the rail and highway systems, so as to isolate the coastal areas selected for assault. For D-Day, the air forces were charged with the responsibility of demolishing selected targets in the enemy's coastal defenses, of providing overhead cover, and rendering general fighter-bomber support.
The Nazi planes that got off the ground didn't get very far. Allied pilots gave it the A treatment. In England, early on D-Day, gliders which were to carry GIs to reinforce the paratroopers were prepared for the takeoff. The first group of 51 gliders carried about 150 men, plus anti-tank weapons, to be landed before the beaches were invaded. In the early morning of June 6th, the first group of gliders was pulled off the ground and towed out across the channel, to be cut loose over the area where the paratroopers had dropped earlier. The small fields in which they were forced to land caused serious losses.
report came from the airborne units I had visited only a few hours earlier and was most encouraging in tone.
Saint-Mary-Glisse was the first town to be captured by American paratroopers early on D-Day morning. In addition to seizing key spots to facilitate the advance of the major forces, the airborne troops proved invaluable as scouts. One of their most important functions was the determination of enemy strength throughout the French coastal provinces. Meanwhile, in the rough waters of the Channel, the giant invasion fleet was proceeding carefully toward the French coast, carrying the greatest amphibious force in history. Virtually every type of Allied assault vessel was pressed into use for the operation. The invasion armada had a complement of 4,100 ships and small craft and carried 150,000 troops, thousands of vehicles and weapons, and tons of supplies. In spite of close quarters in the Channel, the vast invasion fleet made the crossing successfully, suffering the loss of not a single vessel by German action. With all in readiness and H-hour drawing close, the men rededicated their efforts. The GIs and the Navy gun crews waited expectantly for an enemy air attack, but strangely, there was none. One of the most important and dirtiest of preparatory jobs was done by the minesweepers, which moved in and exploded mines just off the coast, clearing safe channels for the assault boats. Losses among the 200 minesweepers engaged in this hazardous mission were slight. The Germans, though surprised by our attack in relatively rough weather, were quick to contest the invasion. The coastal defenses, which they had spent years in preparing for this moment, were readied for action without delay. In the early morning hours just before H-hour, when Allied troops were scheduled to set foot on French soil, the showdown battle of Europe was begun. While the troops prepared to go ashore, the savage battle for domination of the beaches started. Allied warships trained their heavy guns on the German coastal defenses, which had not been knocked out by the Allied air bombardment. As usual, the destroyers, in closer to the beach, drew the enemy's fire. With their targets spotted, the warships went into action. While the battle raged on, the transports prepared to send their troops ashore. The men embarked calmly on the last leg of their trip. For some, this was their first time in action.
Prepare the cast off!
After the planes and the warships had done their jobs, the final outcome of the mighty battle depended largely on the infantrymen. The GIs and the landing boats were fully aware that they were the center of attention. Springing to the defense of their European fortress, the Germans prepared to mass their strength in the area of our landings for a heavy counterblow. Somehow they hadn't been expecting an Allied landing at that exact time. For the troops, this was it. The British and Canadians, forming the British Second Army, landed on the left flank of the assault against determined Nazi opposition. On the right flank, the American First Army troops stormed ashore under heavy enemy fire. Our victory in World War II hung in the balance.
All right.
3 American divisions poured ashore on Omaha and Utah beaches and fought desperately for a foothold. It looked like a tough battle ahead, with the issue very much in doubt. It was a tough battle, and American prospects for the immediate future were anything but bright. Casualties on D-Day were heavy, especially on Omaha Beach. 3,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, and missing on Omaha Beach alone on that first day. Along some of the beaches, landing conditions were highly unfavorable. Some of the landing boats were badly, and so the combat strength of their units was not seriously diminished. By D-Day afternoon, American artillery was ashore and in use. In the late afternoon of D-Day, some of the beaches were secured, and the troops began the drive inland to keep the enemy off balance. Every Allied advance was slowed down considerably by Nazi obstacles. The French coastal area had been liberally planted with mines, which the Nazis always believed in using plentifully. Our mine detection units reaped an abundant harvest in the country near the beaches. Although the offensive was hampered by the innumerable Nazi mines, the detection units cleared the areas quickly, enabling the troops to move forward without much delay.
Complicating the problem on the American front was the prevalence of formidable hedgerows in the bocage country. In almost every row were hidden machine gunners or small combat teams, who were in perfect position to decimate our infantry as they doggedly crawled and crept to the attack along every avenue of approach.
In their drive up the peninsula toward Cherbourg, the GIs of the First Army, all veterans now, hammered at the Nazis without let-up. There were no large-scale surrenders, but enough prisoners were taken to supply Allied intelligence officers with up-to-the-minute information about the enemy. During the first week's fighting, Allied casualties mounted with appalling swiftness to thousands of dead, wounded, and missing.
As the conflict wore on, I grew constantly more bitter against the Germans, particularly the Hitler gang. On all sides, there was always evidence of the destruction that Hitler's ruthless ambition had brought about. Every battle, every skirmish demanded its price in broken bodies and in the extinction of the lives of young Allied soldiers. Hundreds of broken-hearted fathers, mothers, and sweethearts wrote me personal letters begging for some hope that a loved one might still be alive. Every one of these I answered, and I know of no more effective means of developing an undying hatred of those responsible for aggressive war than to assume the obligation of attempting to express sympathy to families bereaved by it.
Wreckage littered the landing areas, particularly at Omaha Beach, where rough seas and very heavy German fire resulted in the disabling of quantities of our landing craft. On June 7th, the day following the first landings, General Eisenhower, accompanied by his naval commander-in-chief, Admiral Ramsey, toured the assault area offshore by destroyer. The weather had improved considerably, thus making it possible for the Allies to follow up their initial success by quickly landing reinforcements and large quantities of materiel.
The period from D-Day to our decisive breakout was a definite phase of the Allied operation. From the day we landed, The battle never settled down, except in isolated spots, to anything resembling the trench warfare of the First World War. But it was the possibility of such an eventuality that we could never forget. Bradley had predicted that the capture of Cherbourg was going to be a rather nasty job, and counted on speed and boldness as much as upon the strength of his assaulting forces to gain an early decision in that area. His estimate was 10 days if we are lucky, 30 if we are not. All such predictions depended, of course, upon our success in maintaining the scheduled buildup. Landing tables provided in great detail for the daily and hourly arrival of given quantities of every kind of fighting unit, sandwiched in between the ammunition and other supplies which were required not only for the daily operations, but to provide the reserves to sustain continuous action once we should pass to the decisive stages of the battle.
With the historic Normandy landing successfully accomplished, the Allies took stock of their situation. On June 7th, D-Day +1, General Eisenhower and Admiral Ramsey, his naval commander-in-chief, inspected the landing beaches with an eye to the problem of landing the large additional forces needed for the big drive against Hitler's army.
It was necessary to provide a means for sheltering beach supply from the effect of storms. To solve this problem, we undertook to construct artificial harbors on the coast of Normandy. One type of protected anchorage, named Mulberry, was practically a complete harbor. The principal construction unit in the Mulberry was an enormous concrete ship called a Phoenix, box-like in shape, and so heavily constructed that when numbers of them were sunk end to end along a strip of the coast, they would probably provide solid protection against almost any wave action. Elaborate auxiliary equipment to facilitate unloading and all types of gear required in the operation of a modern port were planned for and provided. British and American sectors each had one of the Mulberry ports. Here, ships and landing craft could continue to unload in any except the most vicious weather. We had simultaneously to build up on the beaches the reserves in troops, ammunition, and supplies that would enable us within a reasonable time to initiate deep offensives with the certainty that these could be sustained through an extended period of decisive action.
As in every campaign in World War II, one of the first orders of business following the invasion was the quick construction of airfields from which to support the advance of the ground forces. Experienced construction units built new airfields on the continent as fast as they were called for. In each case, the strips were in use a miraculously short time after the men started work. The results of their efficiency were readily felt, especially by the enemy. Less than a week after the assault troops had stormed ashore on the Normandy beaches, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces was the host for a tour of inspection of the area by several unexpected visitors from Washington.
I arranged to take General Marshall, Admiral King, General Arnold, and a group from their respective staffs into the beachhead during the day of June 12th. Their presence, as they roamed around the areas with every indication of keen satisfaction, was heartening to the troops. The importance of such visits by the High Command can scarcely be overestimated in terms of their value to soldiers' morale. On that same day, June 12, 1944, the first flying bomb, known as V-1, reached London. The V-1 was a small, pilotless airplane which flew at high speed on a predetermined course and terminated its flight by means of settings in its mechanism. It contained a large amount of explosive which detonated upon contact, and the blast effect was terrific. The depressing effect of the bombs was not confined to the civilian population. Soldiers at the front began again to worry about friends and loved ones at home, and many American soldiers asked me whether I could give them any news about particular towns in southern England. The effect of...
Every means at hand was used to try to explode them before they landed. In Germany, construction was being rushed on newer, more devastating weapons. In the final stages of its experimental phase, the V-2 rocket bomb was being readied for use against England. In early tests, many V-2s turned out to be failures. But after 2 years of experimentation, the rockets were performing well enough for leading German engineers to persuade Hitler that their use in large numbers against England would achieve wholesale destruction. The first non-experimental launching was set for late summer.
On June 19th, the hurricane struck us. It stopped for a period of 4 days nearly all landing activity on the beaches and therefore interfered seriously with every operation. During that time, sea communications between the United Kingdom and the continent were completely interrupted. On the day of the storm's ending, I counted more than 300 wrecked vessels above small boat size, some so badly damaged they could not be salvaged. There was no sight in the war that so impressed me with the industrial might of America as the wreckage on the landing beaches. To any other nation, the disaster would have been almost decisive. But so great was America's productive capacity that the great storm occasioned little more than a ripple in the development of our buildup. General Bradley had predicted that the capture of Cherbourg was going to be a rather nasty job and counted on speed and boldness as much as upon the strength of his assaulting forces to gain an early decision in that area. His estimate was 10 days if we are lucky, 30 if we are not.
The capture of Cherbourg, a major port, was a matter of immediate importance. American GIs of the 7th Corps assigned to the job expected stiff resistance from the defending Nazi garrison. Before our big guns went into action to soften up the German positions, American Cub planes again proved invaluable in spotting enemy strongpoints. Once their positions were spotted, our attack got going without delay.
Fire!
Cherbourg itself was strongly defended. But by June 25th, the first American troops forced their way into the city after a vicious battle and paved the way for the final capture. But first, the GIs had a last remnant of the Nazi garrison to silence. The GIs had to finish them off, one by one. Cherbourg finally fell on June 27th, just 3 weeks after D-Day. The area yielded some 39,000 Nazi prisoners, most of whom had fought stubbornly until confronted by American infantry patrols. These Nazis seemed surprised indeed to find themselves in Allied hands, and especially in such a short time. Their grandiose dreams of victory had never ended in such a humiliating spectacle. After several days, there were few reminders of the Nazi occupation. To the citizens of Cherbourg, life began again. The Nazis, in their customary fashion, had succeeded in pretty thoroughly wrecking Cherbourg. But the Allies now controlled a major port, which would enable them to deliver large quantities of supplies to the troops much more quickly. General Eisenhower was greatly pleased with the performance of the troops under Generals Bradley and Lieutenant Joe Collins on the western flank in the Battle of the Beachhead. In their first real test on French soil, they had come through in fine style.
Montgomery's tactical handling of the British and Canadians on the eastward flank involved the kind of work in which he excelled. The morale of his forces remained high, in spite of frustrations and losses that could easily have shaken troops under a commander in whom they did not place their implicit trust. Caen did not fall to our initial rush as we had hoped. The battling in that area reached a sustained and intensive pitch. Rommel defended tenaciously.
For weeks, the battle for Caen raged, but the Germans continued to hold on under Montgomery's heaviest assault. After a month of steady bombing and shelling, Caen finally was taken by Montgomery's men on July 9th. The community, or what was left of it, was liberated at last, and the townsfolk no longer moved about in the shadow of the Nazi conquerors. The younger inhabitants, who had been children when the Nazis swept through France in 1940, were especially happy to be liberated. After the capture of Caen by the British, the advance of Allied forces on all fronts was slowed down.
The battle for position and the building up reserves progressed at times with disappointing slowness. There always exists the problem of maintaining morale among fighting men while they are suffering losses and are meanwhile hearing their commanders criticized.
To offer a lift to morale, General Eisenhower personally decorated a number of GIs who had distinguished themselves in battle. The need for nourishing food and sufficient rest became matters of primary concern for even the most hardened combat soldiers. If they were to stay in good fighting trim, these needs had to be satisfied periodically, even though it meant that they would have to be pulled out of the lines in a tough campaign. Most effective morale builder for many GIs was a chance to renew their spiritual lives. To many GIs who had their faith to comfort them, even the prospect of death seemed easier to bear, which were not grim. In many of the liberated French towns and villages, the inhabitants were anxious to demonstrate their appreciation of deliverance from their Nazi conquerors. Meanwhile, a concentrated Allied attack was already overdue. The key point on the Allied offensive was the town of Saint-Lô, from which Allied commanders planned to break out in spite of strong enemy counteraction. The capture of Saint-Lô was a major step in breaking through the heavy layer of Nazi resistance.
The weather, which had been bad, grew abominably worse, and for the following week, all of us went through a period of agonizing tenseness. We had to draw plans to take advantage of the first favorable break in the weather. Finally, on July 25th, 7 weeks after D-Day, the attack was launched from the approximate line we had expected to hold on D+5, stretching from Caen through Caen to Saint-Lô.
As expected, the Allies had a tough job on their hands.
Progress on the first day was slow, but it was always slow going in the early phases of such an attack.
With the Germans fighting desperately to contain them, Bradley's forces continued their punishing attack.
In the following week, he slashed his way downward to the base of the peninsula. With a clean and decisive breakout achieved, Bradley's immediate problem became that of inflicting on the enemy the greatest possible destruction.
The Allies drove almost due south through Avran. The First Army then turned eastward to hit the Germans' flank, but the enemy contested this action.
His attacks, which were thrown in at the town of Mortain, just east of Avranches, began on August 7th.
The weight of the Nazi assault was centered on a 5-mile front between Mortain and Sourdeval, which was defended by 2 American divisions. Throwing 6 somewhat battered tank divisions into the battle, the Nazis continued their counteroffensive for 3 days. Their gains were tiny, a matter of only a few miles, but they fanatically carried on their attack in spite of equally determined opposition. They used every available weapon in their sustained attack on our tanks and troops. They matched us weapon for weapon.
From time to time, all over New England, we gather at our town halls to hammer out the public opinion in meetings like this. Sometimes the meetings get out of hand, and we argue back when the moderator raps for order. But we like it that way, because we figure we elected him to the job in the first place. This particular meeting was pretty much like all the rest, except that the moderator called on Joseph. Joseph was self-conscious, and I had to persuade him to speak. This was Joseph's first town meeting, his first and his last. 6 months before, Joseph had been a stranger to Cummington. As Joseph's minister, I felt I had come to know him a little better than others had in those 6 months. And watching him speak, as a neighbor and friend, I was remembering the day Joseph arrived with his wife Anna and the others. had heard of these refugees at a conference of ministers. They needed a place to live. My church had a house standing vacant. And I had an idea. Perhaps the refugees could have found another place to live, and undoubtedly the good people of Cummington would have preferred it that way. But then, that's what gave me the idea. The first night. What do people do their first night in a strange house? Certainly you don't want to talk to anyone. So I said good night and went home to work on my sermon for Sunday. Sunday was clear, a good day for church, because we like to make a social event out of it. It's a close community feeling we have about our churches. We like to stand around and chat before the service. That's me with the blind organist. Sometimes I think it's too close, almost parochial. But maybe that's because originally, hundreds of years ago, our communities were built around the church. First church in Cummington, 1780. First house 7 years later, 1787. Almost before I had begun my sermon, I heard a commotion in the balcony and looked down to see the refugees filing in. Late, of course, as the widow Susanna Archer said. I was moved because I knew they came from many different churches and denominations, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, and I took it as a gesture to me. So I began again, taking my text from Leviticus. The stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself. I was sure it helped the lonely feeling of the refugees. I wasn't so sure about the townspeople of Cummington. Only time would tell. Toward the end of the service, I noticed one incident that gave me some hope. I guess, with the music and all, it was too much for Anna. But when I heard about Joseph's visit to the grocery store, I began to realize sermons take a while to sink in. It seems he ran smack into the old Stove League, most exclusive club in America, and another place where the boys carve out public opinion. Everyone went right on doing what he was doing. And Joseph felt at first like no one knew he was there. But that wasn't true. Because the minute his back was turned, they looked up, curious as kittens. And Joseph knew it. I've given a lot of thought to that day, and I'm sure the boys were just as self-conscious as Joseph. The trouble was, no one knew how to begin, how to make the first move. So I realized I'd have to make the first move myself, take people by the arm and lead them together. Peter, one of the refugees, had been a printer of fine books, art editions, back in Austria. So I took him out to the Cummington Press to meet Jim Orchard. I knew Jim could understand the old man's desire to get back to his craft. It wasn't hard to tell that he'd been away from his work for a long, long time. For all his politeness, he couldn't keep his hands off the presses. So Jim agreed to take Peter under his wing. And as I left, Jim was already promising to take Peter over to see the collection of books at the Bryant Memorial Library, across the meadow from the press. The great American poet's house has been kept as it was the day he died, with his own collection of fine editions and manuscript. Here were the things Peter loved most, things he'd been away from too long. He must have remembered how many of these same books he'd seen burned in the streets of his own hometown. And he must have recalled that Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman sat in this same room 100 years ago, planning, arguing, writing against slavery with their friend Bryant. And a plan for the work he was going to do began to form in Peter's mind. Then, Max went to work helping out on the widow Susanna Archer's farm. Susanna's boy had just been drafted, and she needed a man who could handle the farm machinery. Max had been a mechanic in Czechoslovakia. And over at the sawmill, the workmen got to know Sasha and understand his shyness in the best practical way, over the workbench. During the summer, Joseph and Anna opened a knick-knack shop, and the local girls got into the habit of dropping around to help out. I used to come by myself of a Saturday afternoon to enjoy a little music with Joseph and the hall girl. Frankly, I think Joseph and Anna were a little surprised to find Mozart in Cummington. Surprised and pleased. I think in many different ways. While we were getting to know the refugees better, they were learning about the New England countryside and its people. Our land is similar to their own, chopped into small one-man, two-man farms. The soil is difficult, and the weather's cruel sometimes. We're not the breadbasket of America, but if you work hard, the autumn harvest will give you back enough for your family and a little left over to take to market. And of course, we set aside one of the best of everything to exhibit at the fair. It's a hard life, and often a lonely life, and maybe that accounts for the way we act sometimes. With the fall, there was a harvest in human relations, too. One day, the boy from down the street came bearing gifts. He had a speech all prepared, which he promptly forgot like his mother knew he would. But it made me feel that perhaps my idea had taken root, too. Out at the press, Peter was having a harvest of his own. He was finishing his woodcut of Bryant to be displayed in the art exhibit at the fair. And the title page he designed for Emerson's essay on self-reliance was coming off the press. He was back at work in his craft, a part of his shop. Then there was the night Joseph was taken to sit with the old Stove League. That was a good night. I don't say all the self-consciousness was gone, but there was a new kind of respect on both sides. I think the excitement of the fair must be the same all over the world. To me, it's a celebration, putting the exclamation point to the end of a good harvest. It brings people together to show off the results of a year's work to their neighbors, to learn from each other in good, friendly competition. the end of the day, you know a little more about yourself and your neighbor. And you have a picture taken so you won't forget a good day in your life. I was thinking of all these things as I watched Joseph speak. He was telling the town meeting that he would be leaving soon to go home and help rebuild his own country. But he'd take with him many things he had learned from his neighbors in Cummington. Picture of a land and people very much like his own. That's about all there was to my idea in the first place. That the strangeness between people breaks down when they live and work and meet together as neighbors. I think the idea worked. At least, if the boys on the post office porch had been reluctant to welcome strangers, they were also reluctant to say goodbye to friends.
Remember the days when you collected souvenirs just for remembrance? Remembrance of pleasant hours, hours of days to be lived over again in memory. That souvenir of the big fella that didn't get away, and the souvenir of the little fellow who grew up and did go away. There are a lot of those little fellows away now, millions of them, scattered along the wide battlefronts of our war, and only some of them will return. A part of them, some little personal part, collected by their chaplains for return to loved ones. Memories touched by death, addressed from nowhere. These personal effects are shipped back to the Army's Quartermaster Effects Depot in Kansas City. A strange, sad warehouse filled with echoes. Here the mementos which outlived death are sorted and wrapped for the final journey home. Through these bins pass the follow-up on every casualty list. 2,000 bundles each month. 2,000 men each month. Souvenirs, just for remembrance. Just for a last remembrance. Pair of broken sunglasses. Comb with some missing teeth. A key ring. A favorite pipe. A rabbit's foot. Good luck charm. A bundle of souvenirs instead of a man. All that is left of those who have already died for us in this war. These and the memory and the tears. Right now, there are enough fighting Americans overseas to send back those heartbreak souvenirs to 5 million American homes. If our men overseas don't keep getting all-out support from us. Work, sweat, prayers, and war bonds. Over 5 million men fighting overseas, wanting to live. Let's have the men back instead of the souvenirs.
1944. For 2 long years, Europe has waited for liberation. Hitler still occupies the entire continent, but everywhere he's on the defensive. The German armies are retreating in Russia. The Allies have invaded Italy and are marching on Rome. They're certain to land in the west this year. Hitler has built his Atlantic Wall, which extends from Norway to the Pyrenees, passing through Pas-de-Calais and the beaches of Normandy.
Hitler has ordered that it be made an impregnable fortress. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, is now Commander-in-Chief of Army Group B and Inspector General of the coasts of Holland, Belgium and France, a 900-mile front. For Rommel, the battle will be fought here on the beaches. He will throw the British and American forces straight back into the sea. This will be the longest day, he warns. Rommel is not happy from the moment he sets foot on the shore. Why are these beaches so utterly devoid of obstructions? Wooden stakes and concrete piles. At high tide, they'll be hidden below the surface, and on landing will pierce the Allies' boats. To avoid them, the enemy will have to disembark at low tide. Then they'll be in gun sight for a long time with no cover. He sows millions of mines on the shore and in the sea. He's going to flood all the lowlands from Holland to the Cotentin Peninsula. What Rommel doesn't know is that the French resistance has procured the complete plans of the Atlantic Wall and has succeeded in getting them to London. The Allies know the position of each pillbox, the caliber of every gun, the strength of each infantry unit. At the Casablanca conference, Roosevelt and Churchill have agreed to continue the war until the unconditional surrender of Germany. Churchill wants to attack in the south through the Balkans, with the political motive of reaching Berlin before the Russians. But at the Tehran conference, Roosevelt and Stalin insist that the landing should be from the west. The second front that Stalin had wanted for the last 2 years will start on the Atlantic coast somewhere in France. General Marshall, Chief of General Staff, is the leading planner of the American Army. He wants to command the operation on the Western Front himself. But Roosevelt, considering the war in the Pacific and Japan as well, is against it. Marshall offers Roosevelt one of his personal staff, Eisenhower. On Christmas Day, 1943, Eisenhower becomes Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe.
In effect, the stage is being set for the beginning of the great and crucial test all over the world. I have complete confidence that the soldiers, sailors, and airmen, and all the civil populations of the United Nations will demonstrate once and for all that an aroused democracy is the most formidable fighting machine that can be devised.
Eisenhower has installed his general staff at Southwick House on the English coast. 4 are English and 3 American. February 1944. The Air Force has already begun to prepare the ground. The French pilots of the Groupe Lorraine take part in these tactical bombing missions. In 4 months, 6,000 planes make 22,000 sorties and drop 76,000 tons of bombs on occupied France. Between the Seine and the Loire, all crossroads, railway stations and bridges are being systematically destroyed. This will prove fatal to the movement of German armor in the battles to come. May 1944. All units are camped in the south of England, and the assembly points are out of bounds to civilians and severely controlled. The hour approaches. Rations are distributed and occupation money in francs. So the landing is going to be somewhere in France. But where? The soldiers will now depend on their training and their weapons to see them through. Both will have to be as sharp as possible to defeat the experienced German soldiers waiting on the other side of the water. There's plenty of time to write long letters to parents in Sussex or Oklahoma. The last, perhaps. Censorship. For several days, even ambassadors are unable to communicate with their governments. England is cut off from the world. At last, the landing plans are studied on the meticulously accurate scale models. Every single tree is there, but the place names are fictitious. Is it Brittany, Normandy, or Pas-de-Calais? General George Patton, christened Old Blood and Guts by the GIs in Italy, has positioned his troops just outside Dover, opposite Pas-de-Calais. But this turns out to be just another maneuver to deceive the enemy. It completely misleads the Germans. It is exactly here, in the Pas-de-Calais, that they are waiting for the Allied attack. This is the most fortified spot on the Atlantic coast. Rommel, nervous and tired, decides to leave for Germany. It's his wife's birthday. He's also arranged a meeting with Hitler to ask for more reinforcements. The weather report is bad, so he sets off the following morning at dawn, after reassuring his troops.
Im Hinblick auf unsere starken Anlagen, im Hinblick auf den vorzüglichen Geist unserer Truppe, auf die neue Bewaffnung und die Kampfmittel, die uns in die Hand gegeben sind, können wir den kommenden Ereignissen mit größter Ruhe entgegensehen und brauchen uns keine Sekunde den Kopf zu brechen, ob es gut oder schlecht geht. Es geht bestimmt gut und ich glaube nicht, dass der Engel ein zweites Mal wiederkommt, wenn er hier den Versuch macht.
Meanwhile, in the English ports, the troops have embarked. Loaded like pack horses, they've been issued with all equipment in triplicate. The soldiers crowd together in the holds of the ships and wait. But 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Why? The sun is still shining brightly. The most difficult thing to bear is inaction. Fighting men who fret gradually lose the fine edge of morale that has taken so long to prepare. Card games are no substitute for the release of tension. Everything depends on the weather, in fact, and also on the tide and the moonlight. In spite of appearances, the weather forecast is bad. They want to land on June the 5th, but have to turn back. The storm is too fierce in the channel. The 6th of June is still all right. The 7th is also possible, but the 8th will be too late. Eisenhower sees the effect this waiting is having on the army's morale. But what can he do? He hasn't arranged this blasted weather. On Sunday at 9 o'clock in the evening, the Chief Meteorological Officer, Group Captain J.M. Stagg, forecasts a clearing for Tuesday the 6th. Everyone turns to Ike.
I thought it was just the best of a bad bargain, so I possibly sat silently just reviewing these things, maybe, well, I'd say 35 or 45 seconds. Now it's been reported by some of the people present. For example, my own chief staff says that's 5 minutes. Well, I know that one, but 5 minutes under such conditions sounds like a year. Actually, I'd think after 30, 45 seconds, something like that, I just got up and said, okay, we'll go, and this room was emptied in 2 seconds.
Along 20 miles of front, the most formidable armada of all time sails towards France, making the journey in reverse of William the Conqueror 9 centuries earlier. 5,000 ships, protected by 700 naval vessels, watched over by 13,000 planes, and carrying 140,000 troops. Out in the Channel, the storm hasn't died down yet. The weathermen have been mistaken about that. At At last, battle orders can be opened. No, it's not Pas-de-Calais, it's Normandy. Meanwhile, on the English airfields, 20,000 paratroopers prepare for the big jump. 2 American divisions, the 101st under General Maxwell Taylor, and the 82nd under General Ridgway and General Gavin, and 1 British division under General Gale. Eisenhower has a heavy responsibility. It's been predicted that he could lose 80% of these men. They've never seen action and believe for a few hours only that they're going to play cowboys and Indians, that the whole thing is a big game. The pilots have stage fright even worse than the paratroopers. Between them, they have only a few dozen flying hours. They've been told, all you have to do is follow the plane in front of you. Don't worry about anything else. On the Cotentin Peninsula, the wind has blown them off their route. The pilots look for their drop zone and the flares. Go, 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 shout the sergeants. And everyone jumps a little wildly, scattered over 24 miles. Every man falls where he can, in a tree, in a garden, in the marshes, where he drowns. By morning, a regiment of the 82nd has succeeded in regrouping and taking its objective, Sainte-Mère-Église. A third of the paratroopers have fallen in the little village square, right in the middle of the Germans. The objective is the region between the Vire Valley and the Valley of the Orne. Security has been secured by 2 paratroop drops, one around Sainte-Mère-Église, 2 American divisions, and the other to the west of Caen, a British parachute division. Since dawn, the planes and battleships have been pounding the beaches. The landing itself will take place on 5 code-named beaches. Sword, in front of Oistrom, a British beach. Juno, in front of Corsair, a Canadian beach. Gold, in front of Arromanches, another British beach. And 2 American beaches, Omaha and Utah. The first near Vireville, and the second in front of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Altogether, 9 Allied divisions with about 200,000 men. Opposite them, 9 German divisions at about the same strength. The Allies haven't therefore got superiority on the ground. Nevertheless, on Utah Beach, everything is going well. The first assault wave is commanded by General Teddy Roosevelt, 57 years old, cousin of the President. The Air Force has leveled the Atlantic Wall. The German land troops, stunned by the bombardment, surrender without a real fight. And the Americans advance immediately inland to rendezvous with the paratroops at Sainte-Mère-Église. The fascinated Normans can hardly believe their eyes, while the children stare open-mouthed at these soldiers from the skies. For the moment, it's a military walkover. So where are the Germans? They're there, crouching in ambush. A battalion of the 6th Regiment under Colonel von der Heip, specially trained for anti-air landing operations, waiting for the Americans on the road to Carentan. The German soldiers are well trained and still confident of defeating the untried Allied soldiers who are thrown ashore in what appears to be a desperate gamble. There are a few commanding officers, however, who understand more of the task facing them. Colonel von der Heydt, who commands the anti-parachute operations around Carentan, had installed his command post in the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. When he climbed into the church tower to look out towards the coast, he saw a sight that was enough to dishearten the bravest soldier. The Allied invasion fleet lay offshore, his soldiers hidden in the bushes, waiting for the first wave of American troops, were wise to skulk and hide in ambush. The tide of military power coming in was awesome. The first American prisoners confirm it. Yes, it really is the landing. But they seem to be thinking to themselves, wait and see what's in store for you. On the Omaha beach, all hell is let loose. The Allied Air Force has missed its target. The German defenses are intact. The first assault wave is stuck in the mud, but the others are already following. The second, third, and fourth. The tide rises. Thousands of men are crowded together between the sea and the cliff. The amphibian tanks have been put into the sea too soon. They are foundering, one after the other. General Cotter pulls himself up and drags along a handful of men to mount an assault on the blockhouse. The Omaha landing succeeds, but at a terrible price. 2,000 dead, wounded, or missing. At Hock Point, the 225 Rangers of Colonel Ruder scale the cliffs with grappling irons and rope ladders. Mission: to neutralize a long-range battery. When they take possession of it, Colonel Ruder has lost half his men, and he sees that the guns aren't there. They've been moved inland. For 48 hours, the resistance had been trying to inform London. From the English coast, all night and all morning, gliders dropped 6,000 paratroops onto the banks of the Orne, somehow or other, more by luck than judgment. The mission of the British paratroops is to secure the bridge of Bennoville on the Orne. On the British beaches, codenamed Gold and Sword, the Tommies remind themselves of Lord Astley's prayer before the battle. My God, in a few moments I'm going to be very busy. I shall surely forget you, but don't you forget me. The 1st Commando Brigade lands in front of Oostrum. Colonel Dawson, Chief of General Staff, orders the 2 landing craft carrying General Kiefer's commandos to go in. price of heavy losses, Kiefer's commandos take the blockhouse the Germans had built in the square of the Casino de Rivabella. Now they can carry on towards the bridge at Benneville, where the paratroops are waiting. At the head of the commandos is the youngest general in the British Army, already a veteran of Narvik and Dieppe. 30 years old, a Scottish peer, General Lord Lovat. With Lord Lovat was Bill Millin, his personal piper. 30 years later, Bill Millin returns to the bridge of Benneville to play blue bonnets over the border, as he had in 1944, when he marched alone over the bridge to pipe his defiance. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 10 hours after the landing, Rommel's only armoured division, the 21st Panzers, launch a counterattack. The Germans discover in their turn the attractions of the Allied equipment, the Jeep, which they enthusiastically adopt. At the end of the day, the 21st Panzers reach the beach at Luce-sur-Mer, the only Germans ever to do so. Rommel was right. It was here that the battle should have been fought. It was too late now. The Germans fall back to their previous position. Rommel returns from Germany the same evening, June the 6th. He inspects the front and interrogates General Meindel's paratroops himself. Then he goes to Saint-Germain to see old Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief in the West. Rommel is furious. He wants armoured troops, armour at any price. He must shorten the front and counterattack quickly. But Hitler obstinately keeps the Panzer SS in reserve. The Führer will listen to nothing. He has no confidence in anyone. What if this landing is a trick, he said. To all appearances, he lives in a dream of secret weapons, the V1, the flying bombs with which he has decided to destroy London. In 15 days, 2,000 V1s are launched on England, causing considerable havoc. But the British have experienced similar horrors before. It takes more than the buzz bombs to change the course of the war. At last, Hitler believes the invasion. From all corners of Europe, from Russia, from Germany, and above all from France, German reinforcements make for Normandy. Il fait chaud à Suez, il fait chaud à Suez, repeats the BBC. That's the signal. The French resistance joins in the battle. All over France, 30,000 Maquisards, armed only with Tommy guns and explosives, harass the German convoys, slowing down their progress towards the front. It's called Operation Tortoise. Their action, said Eisenhower, saved us 5 divisions. Revenge is swift and savage, and the Germans find Frenchmen, Darnan's militia, to help them kill and torture other Frenchmen. SS division Das Reich, which is coming up from Toulouse, is held back by 4 days. Exasperated, the SS leave terror in their wake. At Oradour-sur-Glane, they shut all the people in the church and set it alight. At Toul, they hang hostages from the balconies. The nearer they approach the battlefield, the more their pace slows down. Goebbels' propaganda tries to build up the morale of the troops and insists, Eisenhower hasn't surprised us. Propaganda is of little comfort to the German soldier, and he undergoes all the shattering effects of the American fighter-bomber attacks. The German fighters are nowhere to be seen, and the Allied planes can carry out their strikes unopposed. The Luftwaffe has been pushed right back into Germany by the Allied fighter sweeps, and the shortage of fuel and pilots has eliminated the once feared German air power. On the evening of June the 6th, the Allies haven't attained all their objectives. In the west, the link has been made between Utah Beach and the paratroops. Vierville, Omaha Beach, is closely surrounded by the Germans, and the British forces themselves are divided by the German counterattack at Luce-sur-Mer. Above all, Caen, the principal objective of D-Day, is still in German hands. The Americans go up the Cotentin Peninsula, following a road marked by ruined villages. For the Normans, liberation has two faces, war and friendship. In advance of their other countrymen, they learn several American words, GI, Jeep, OK. After the hard battles for Boulogne and Mondebourg, the Americans approach Cherbourg. The Germans have entrenched themselves there. Hitler has cabled, even if the worst comes to the worst, Cherbourg must be defended to the last man. All Germany is watching you. For a whole week, the town has had to be cleaned up house by house. The town has fallen, but General von Schlieben and Admiral Reinecke have locked themselves in the fortress with the rest of the garrison. German soldiers, surrender. This is your last chance. The loudspeakers of the psychological warfare unit join the bombardment. Before surrendering, the Germans blow up all the port installations. By June the 30th, it's over. With 800 survivors, General von Schlieben surrenders to General Collins. Hitler has a fit of hysterics and publicly calls Schlieben a coward. Cherbourg is taken, Cherbourg, of which nothing remains. In 19 days, record time, American engineering know-how, helped by French workmen, put the port in working order. In 2 weeks, the Allies have already built 2 artificial ports, the Mulberry Harbours. Now the point of those enormous structures, made in secret in England, which followed the landing fleet across the Channel, becomes obvious. Dozens of boats have been brought over to form breakwaters. Old merchant ships are filled with cement and sunk. They are 200 feet long and weigh 6,000 tons. Finally, 11 miles of jetties are constructed with hundreds of floating pontoons. The English dock has been constructed at Arromanches and christened Winston in honor of Churchill, who had the idea of trying this giant Meccano set. The second, the American port, has been installed in front of Saint Laurent. On June the 19th, a storm blew up, the most violent that had ever been experienced for that time of year. Eventually, the American dock had to be abandoned, but the British Winston held. In 2 months, 2 million men and 500,000 vehicles had disembarked at Arromanches. The extent of the Allies' preparations continues to stagger the Germans. One week after the landing, the Americans have constructed 45 landing strips in metallic mesh. They are erected in a few hours. From now on, fighter cover is immediately available. Lost on a deserted beach in the south of England, this strange ice cream parlour is really a secret pumping station. To keep the expeditionary force supplied with fuel, Churchill has the idea for a pipeline, codenamed Pluto, whose enormous reels unroll and lie along the bottom of the Channel. This pipeline will follow the Allied divisions right into Germany. For 4 years, Churchill has waited for this moment. For 4 years, he'd said to Parliament, "You ask me what is my goal? I reply to you with one word, victory." Now he had it. He wanted to land with the British troops himself. But when the King heard the news, he decreed, "Very well, if my Prime Minister is going there, I shall go too." It was the only way of preventing the old British Lion from going to war at 70 years of age. King George VI congratulates Montgomery in his turn. For Eisenhower, the diplomatist general, there is now a grave political problem, that of free France. Roosevelt refuses to recognize the provisional government of General de Gaulle and wants to install an American military administration in France, AMGOT, until the end of the war. Churchill is in a difficult position because he has always supported the Free French and realizes their importance to the Allied cause. De Gaulle has been keeping to himself in Algiers, away from the Allied planners, resentful of Roosevelt's hostility to his viewpoint and achievements in rallying the French nation. He cannot admit that the Americans would control occupied France in his place. It's a political crisis of the worst sort. If de Gaulle does not cooperate and the Americans do not accept his leadership, the Allied invasion will face unknown complications. In the end, de Gaulle makes his point. Eisenhower holds a long conference with him on the eve of the Normandy landings. The two men understand each other. When he sets foot on the Corsair beach on June the 14th, This gesture has a symbolic value too, political as well as military. For him, the only legitimate France is that which, like himself, refuses to accept defeat. Montgomery, who marks time in front of Caen for 3 weeks, decides on June the 26th to launch a big offensive, Operation Neptune. But the weather is overcast and the Allied planes are unable to take off to support the advance of the Sherman tanks. 5 armoured SS divisions are waiting for the British attack. They are equipped with Tiger 48-ton tanks, armed with the famous 88 gun. Tigers savage the Allied tanks. One single crew destroys 16 Shermans in 1 hour. Operation Epsom is halted in its tracks. The young recruits, turned into fanatics by Hitler, can still laugh. But the weather is clearing. Allied planes are airborne again. They attack the aerodrome of Carthage in the suburbs of Caen, which is held by the 12th SS Panzer Division. Rocket-firing typhoons pulverize the German positions. Montgomery wants to make an end and decides to wipe out the German defenses. On July the 7th, he looses 467 heavy bombers on Caen before attacking the town from the front. On July the 8th, a month after the landing, Canadian tanks rumble into the town. After 10 days of fighting in the streets, the British achieved the capture of Caen. Montgomery, criticized from London for the slowness of his advance, wants to push on at once on the road to Paris. He inaugurates Operation Goodwood of July the 18th with a formidable bombardment of the steelworks of Colombelle to the north of the Orne, where the Germans are entrenched. The Cromwell tanks set themselves in motion at 5:30 in the morning on July the 18th. The Tigers, having been knocked out by the bombardment, the British divisions follow the railway line from Cagny and advance freely onto the plain. Unexpectedly, they're shattered by the anti-aircraft batteries of the German 88mm cannons. The Germans use new anti-tank weapons like the guided Goliaths, and the rocket launchers imitations of Stalin's weapons. More than 1,200 British tanks are destroyed. Operation Goodwood is halted. In the west, General Bradley's Americans, whose objective is Saint-Lô, are also held up. It's impossible to press forward in this maze of hedgerows where there are snipers and paratroops and SS units of the German 7th Army. Only the little Piper Cubs, the eyes of the artillery, can help to clean up the area, one hedgerow after another. Even the tanks are caught up in the tangle. 12 divisions take 17 days to advance 6 miles. An American handyman, Sergeant Cullen, then invents a new monster, the rhinoceros. Using Rommel's iron stakes from the beach defences, he prepares spurs which are welded to the front of the tanks. Thanks to him, the armoured troops break free of the thickets and go forward again. On July the 18th, the Americans at last seize Saint-Lô. The first jeep to enter the town carries a coffin on its foot, draped with the stars and stripes. It's the body of Major Howie. He had sworn to be the first to enter Saint-Lô. His men have respected his wish. General Hodges' tanks have broken through. Patton's army sweeps across the breach, and the advance of the armies through the liberated towns begins to take on an air of triumph. Meanwhile, Hitler, proudly holding out his bandaged hand, is smiling. Why the bandage? On July the 20th, he miraculously escaped from an assassination attempt. In the command post at Rustenburg, Colonel von Stauffenberg, chief of the plotters, had put a bomb under the heavy conference table. Its very thickness saved the Führer's life. Hitler's faithful supporters congratulate him. It's truly a miracle. God is with me, the Führer declares on the radio. On July the 17th, Rommel, seriously wounded by Allied planes, is replaced by Marshal von Kluge. For the Germans, the situation is becoming very dangerous. They have no defense to offer against Patton's army, which spreads through Brittany. On the other flank, Montgomery tries to reach Falaise from Caen. An encirclement seems to be the Allied plan. 5 panzer divisions travel all night to avoid air attacks and hope to surprise the American forces. But at daybreak, they are spotted by 10 squadrons of British Typhoon fighters armed with rockets. The result is catastrophic for the German High Command. One 163 German tanks are destroyed. The Panzer SS are crippled. For the first time in military history, a powerful ground offensive has been stopped by planes alone. On the Normandy beaches, Allied reinforcements continue to flow in. On the 1st of August, the French 2nd Armoured Division lands at Utor Beach, 3 years after General Leclerc, leaving Africa, had sworn not to lay down arms until the French flag is flying over Paris and Strasbourg. 16,000 men, 410 tanks and 650 French guns joined the American armies in a vast turning movement towards the south. By a stroke of genius, General Bradley has the idea of encircling the remains of the 3 German armies, which were retreating towards the Seine. The British closed the pincers in the north. On August the 14th, covered by 1,000 bombers and 720 guns, 900 tanks launched an armored attack in the direction of Falaise. On the morning of the 16th, the Canadians take Falaise and the castle of William the Conqueror. Montgomery telephones Bradley, "We will meet at Chambois." And on August the 19th, the Allies make their rendezvous in this little village on the Dives. Ten German divisions are caught in the trap. On Mount Ormel, General Mazek's poles guard the entry to the Falaise pocket. Montgomery has told them, "You are the cork in the bottle. Hold it well." The poles stood firm and sealed the fate of the trapped German forces. It was a second Stalingrad. In 2 days, 2 German armies dissolved in the cauldron of the Falaise. In 2 days, Hitler lost his best regiments, the crack paratroops and the redoubtable SS Panzer divisions. He had hesitated too long before throwing them into battle. "200,000 dead, wounded, or taken prisoner." The Battle of Normandy had lasted 2 months and 15 days. It was the end of the road for the Germans in the West.